Thank you so much, Rajata. Dr. Shameen, thank you so much for joining us from Shanghai. It's a Friday evening for you, so our apologies in case we are keeping you away from all the fun. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. That's it. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Your book title, Gorillas Can Dance, is amazing. But, instead of me, why don't you just tell us a bit about the book? And I'm really curious about the name itself. So if you could just give us a quick, intro about the book and the name behind it.
Sure. So it's wonderful to join you, Atit, and greetings to you all from Shanghai in China, where we're actually experiencing the biggest COVID surge since COVID had originally come. So it's all a little bit different right now, and most of us are having to go back to working from home and so on. So anyway, thank goodness for technology like this. The book is the result of 15 years of research. And, in 2005, I graduated with a PhD in international business from a school in Scotland. My work was looking at how startups go international. In fact, I was looking at Indian software companies at the time. But also the people in my department, in fact, the senior people had developed a very strong reputation for looking at large multinationals, including IBM, Sun Microsystems, many that had been around in Scotland for a while. And I began to ask the question, why are we looking at these different sets of companies in parallel? And I started observing some examples in Scotland. I was hearing of some startups in Bangalore. Back then, a company called Skelta was partnering with Microsoft. And so after observing this for a few months, the year after I graduated, I mustered up the courage to ask C.K. Prahalad a question during a Q&A session at a conference. And I asked him, do you think it makes sense for me to be studying how startups and big companies work together? And he said, I actually think many startups have no choice but to learn to dance with the big gorilla. So I latched onto that phrase. Initially, I had written an article called Dancing with Gorillas from the perspective of the startups, which garnered some attention. But over time, I kept finding that the big companies were beginning to more systematically engage with startups. That article called Dancing with Gorillas came out in 2008, which happened to be the year that Microsoft introduced BizSpark. And somehow Microsoft was very kind to me. I was a relative nobody in the academic world, but people I reached out to were willing to talk to me and kept talking to me for over a decade. So over time, I began to look at it from the perspective of the big company, and this book is actually from that perspective, and so it's called Gorillas Can Dance.
That's really interesting for a couple of reasons, Dr. Shameen. One is, also has a C.K. Prahalad connection in terms of Bari, having worked with him, and Zinnow's genesis being in one of those conversations. And of course, us being part of that, Microsoft journey, in 2008, 2012 onwards. So we finally get to speak in that sense, yeah.
Indeed.
I do want to sort of, start. We have I think 30 minutes, and then we have Q&A in between. So I want to maybe jump right in, right? So there is this whole aspect of corporates working with startups, right? A common question is that, these programs need to be done from the headquarters, but then the audience that we are talking to right now are in-house capability centers away from headquarters, doing some very critical and interesting work. What has been your observation? What has been your observation in terms of the role of a subsidiary organization in terms of driving innovation in specific, in context of startups? Have you seen something, work, not work? What's your take on it?
So first of all, I should say that my work began in the context of multinational subsidiaries. So the likes of IBM, Sun Microsystems, and so on, engaging with startups in Scotland was very much subsidiaries seeking to do that. And the reason they were doing this is that they were getting frustrated. They had been around in Scotland for 2-3 decades, but their mandate originally was manufacturing. Okay. IBM in Scotland manufactured all the PCs and laptops for the European market. And their export earnings were greater than the export earnings of the Scotch whiskey industry put together.
Oh, wow.
At its peak, it had 6,000 employees. But then they started losing competitiveness, first to Eastern Europe, and then China, and eventually a Chinese company bought over the PC business of IBM, and they went from 6,000 employees to 1,500 employees. What I was observing in India, in Bangalore, in parallel, was Microsoft in India partnering with a startup called Skelta. I met this young Microsoft manager called Rajiv Sodhi at the time, who is now COO at Microsoft India, talking to Microsoft to startups like Skelta. So you could see that there were entrepreneurial managers in subsidiaries who were reaching out to engage with startups. In the case of Microsoft India, it was because they were trying to evangelize their software tools and have these adopted. In Scotland, it was because they were losing relevance. And they wanted to show to headquarters that they were capable of doing innovation, not just lower end stuff, but there was a chicken and egg problem. They could not get the mandate from headquarters. They could not do that without the mandate from headquarters, but they could not get the mandate from headquarters without showing that they could do something. And so, in fact, working with local startups was an under the radar, low cost activity. And that is a hallmark of many subsidiaries in terms of getting started, at least. And also, in BMW, even in some of the more headquarters-driven things that I've observed, BMW Startup Garage, Gregor Gimme, one of the co-founders, had actually joined BMW from IDEO in Silicon Valley. And he was very different from the typical BMW lifer. And, we met in Munich, and there was this very nice, funky-looking, very startup-friendly kind of ambience in the room. And he said, this room, I actually just decorated it by making orders from IKEA. This logo you see, I just went ahead and did it without getting permission from corporate and identity. And the next day after we opened this, I got a call from corporate and identity, and I thought I was in trouble. But they were calling to congratulate me on this. And so his point was, sometimes we are pleasantly surprised when you seek forgiveness rather than permission. All this is to say that I'm not trying to say that it's easy for subsidiaries to do things, but in fact, a lot of the efforts that I have observed either began in subsidiaries or involved managers who displayed the sort of entrepreneurial behavior that you see in subsidiaries, which is to go ahead and try things even if you don't necessarily have the blessing to do that.
Got it. And it's very similar. I thought this was more recent phenomena, but it's interesting to know it's much older, because a lot of global startup collaboration programs actually had their genesis in India. For some of the largest companies, or India team had, a great part in terms of shaping it for better. I'm guessing it's also because subsidiaries, to your point, don't always have sufficient resources. So you have to be frugal and you have to sort of make it count, right? And then you try to figure things out a lot more early. I think in your book and one of our earlier conversations, you had spoken, I think, about Sun Microsystems itself, right? In terms of how they went about securing certain wins. Can you tell us a bit more about that? What happened back in Scotland and the construct of it? Yeah,
absolutely. So again, it was like what I was saying about IBM. This was a company that had a manufacturing facility, but they wanted to do more. And at the time, the belief in Europe was that RFID technology, A, was going to become big, and B, was a little bit ahead of what was happening in the US. And so Sun Microsystems wanted to position itself to take on a leadership role within Europe for Sun. And when they were trying to get the attention of Sun Microsystems in California, they were being rebuffed. And so they reached out to local startups because they thought the real goal, what they had to achieve was to show to headquarters that they had some capability that would qualify them to take a lead on RFID. So they had some innovation projects around RFID, and they ended up partnering with 3 local startups. One bombed very quickly. One looked very promising. It's the one that they thought would be the biggest success, but then eventually found that somehow the entrepreneur and the startup and the chemistry didn't work out, and it was a lot of frustration. But both sides persevered and worked through the challenges and ended up creating a prototype. So right there, you see echoes of this notion of experimentation. Obviously, not all of these things work out, but also you see that with a can-do spirit, you can do things that are what you might think of as low-cost probes. And this success of one of these partnerships led to an RFID mandate being given to Sun Microsystems with regional responsibility.
Got it. I think that's the piece that you joined there, right? Experimentation. I think that's the key, and what we are hoping to do, with our discussion, the panel after this, is to talk about experimentation specific as a prelude or a precursor or a necessity to drive innovation, right? Now, odds are that most of us on this call are engineers, and we do have a preference to sort of build or to sort of even try things out internally. But to sort of help think about experimentation and to help think about startups, which is entities outside, what would be your comment in terms of saying in the larger scheme of experimentation, how might one want to look at startups or the external ecosystem? And is there a pattern that you have observed across the world in any of these successful programs, in terms of how they've approached it?
So great question. Especially after observing Microsoft for a long period of time, I came to the view that there were three key things that were important. One is the way they went about engaging with startups was co-evolving with their strategy. In other words, there was a very good rationale for why they were doing this. And so the first piece to consider always is the why. So even before even embarking on any of this stuff, one needs to have a very clear rationale for what one is trying to achieve and why engaging with startups makes sense. Now, that being the case, the second thing that I observed in Microsoft is that they actually experimented with different partnering formats even. And sometimes now I end up telling people in Microsoft things about the past that they didn't know. So in fact, somebody from Microsoft Egypt reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, I came across your book and I'm ordering a few copies for my colleagues in the MENA region because none of us know this history. Mm-hmm. The how is that second piece about then figuring out how to engage with startups. But of course, what Microsoft has done extremely well, I think, is to engage with startups in different parts of the world. And there's therefore a third aspect, which is the where. I think what you're asking about pertains particularly to the how.
Right.
And so the key is, I think, to recognize two things. The first is that if you are engaging with startups in particular, based on a good rationale for doing so, you are likely to encounter what I call the paradox of asymmetry. So why does it make sense to look at startups? The big company has certain advantages that are complementary for the startup, like the scale and the reputation. The startups have certain capabilities like their agility and speed. So it feels like a match made in heaven, but once you start actually trying to engage, you find that the very differences that make it attractive to partner also make it challenging. So that's the paradox. And what I found, companies like Microsoft, BMW, Unilever, many companies that have taken this seriously, is they have consciously or unconsciously unpacked these asymmetries, understanding that there are goal asymmetries, there are structure asymmetries, and even attention asymmetries, meaning you don't know as a big company which of these many startups to prioritize your limited managerial attention to. And the startups don't know how to get the attention of the right people who matter in the organization. So one part of my answer is, you therefore have to think about how to address these. And one pattern I've seen is that to address the goal asymmetry, it becomes very important to clarify what the synergy is. That might sound blindingly obvious, but every time you hear the term win-win, it's not always clear what the win to each side is. Right. The second piece is creating an interface to help to overcome the structure asymmetry. And the third piece is creating success stories and exemplars so that both sides can see what success is. But my other part to your question is actually, this is about what I've just talked about is understanding what the process is. But that doesn't mean that you become able to do this. And so here you need to initiate, expand, and then finally systematize. Now, the initiation piece is where I think subsidiaries still have a very important role to play. Because you as Zinnov have been very involved in Microsoft, the Microsoft Accelerator program coming into Bangalore a decade ago. But a lot of the ideation behind that format came out of Israel, Microsoft Israel, and a guy called Zach Weisfeld. That was very much a bottom-up approach where the entrepreneurial behaviors matter. I think it's important to though recognize that if these things are eventually to become full-fledged activities, you then have to get support from senior managers. You do need some air cover. That's what's going to help to expand. So the first part of my answer, dealing with asymmetries, is to say, it ain't easy.
Right.
The second part is to say, that doesn't mean that you should lose heart, and initiating is important, that initial experimenting. So experimentation is actually important, not just in terms of, by partnering with startups, I can do more experimentation, which is true. There's also this notion of, I also need to experiment with formats that work and make sure things happen. And eventually, of course, if we really want this to become more mainstream, then we need support from the top. But that is not necessarily what you need to begin.
Right. And I think it's a very important distinction that you called out is that, on one side, you are building something with the startup, and at the same time, you're building the process to work with the startups, which is there. And at least how I end up phrasing that personally is I said, process is not a problem, wrong process or absence of a process is the problem. But that's the point, right? It's a discovery. You can't just lift and shift. Connecting that to your point in terms of the person from Egypt, Microsoft, ordering copies for me, I think what we see today as programs, many times we don't go back into the history of it and how it got initiated and the journey, right? Because what it is today could be very, very different from what it was. I think you had spoken about Bayer, if I'm not wrong, and maybe one other company. But maybe you could give a perspective to the audience in terms of what some of these journeys, how they started and what they are today.
So Bayer is actually a very good example, right? Fuddy-duddy German company that makes aspirin. But back in 2012, this guy called Jesus del Val, who is a Cuban scientist, I guess he moved to Germany, studied there, did his PhD, and became part of Bayer. He had this idea that, digital is going to become important. This was a decade ago. And he said, why don't we give some grants to some university students to build apps that are relevant to health? So this was called Grants for Apps. And it's since been abbreviated to G4A. The following year, he said, hey, why does it have to be just students? It can be startups. So because of the initial success with very little money, he persuaded his superiors to give a little bit of money to do a 3-month accelerator program with 5 startups from Germany. And they just basically used 2 rooms in their building in Berlin and, said, come and we will talk, and connected them to the informatics teams. And, he called it a passion project. So it was him and one other guy putting in a lot of effort. The following year, they said they had something to show for it. 1 or 2 of these startups were very promising. They said, well, let's now open it out to startups from around the world. And so they had 5 startups, including one from Seoul, one from a couple of other, elsewhere in Europe, so on. And then it started building momentum, and G4A became something. And then he was persuading other subsidiaries to try this. So they did it in Spain, they did it in China. That's how I became familiar. And then they hit a point by 2018 where they could see this was so strategically important that they then carved this out into three different aspects. One was, scouting for new startups, and this was managed by a team out of Silicon Valley. Another was about maintaining the existing partnerships, which they did out of Germany, and one other. The most interesting thing in the story, though, was in 2018, Jesus got replaced by someone else. And so one of the things to think about in this journey, not unlike startups, the people who drive the initial energy behind this may not be the ones who are best equipped to manage this once it needs a more managerial approach and a more efficient way of managing. But none of that would have been possible if this guy hadn't had the idea to start something very small called Grants for Apps. So it's like what Simon Sinek says, I think, think big, start small, but start. So I think that's important for the initial spark to be lit. But of course, eventually for these things to take root, if indeed it makes sense, then more stakeholders within the company need to buy into this. And the people who drive it eventually may not be the same people as the ones who helped to create it.
Because it's also a lot about, the person who's starting this, and in terms of typically, to use your word, entrepreneur, or a person with inclination to sort of solve for problems and figure stuff out. And of patience, right, is that you systematically build this capability, you systematically keep showing some success stories and keep building from there. Very similar to startups, right? You get your first customer, first win, and then you keep building from there to scale your processes. The part I want to go to, Dr. Shameen, is the initiation part, right? Now, one thing, which ends up happening is more often than not, the conversation, I don't think I've ever met a corporate who's ever said that they don't want to work with startups. Rather, there's always each year more increased interest to want to work with startups. We also see a lot of companies initiate, but not all of them really succeed in terms of taking, their startup initiatives to the next level. Some of them do, right? Some of them are able to really build it out into a good capability for the company. Some of them are not really able to do it. So if I go to the initiation phase, right, how should one think about it? Like, how should one think about building that capability? Because as we said, right, one is what we're doing is I can work with one startup and that can be an experiment. Then I can work with 3 startups and that can be an experiment. But with scale, things change. Now I'm building the capability to experiment, right? So how do you initiate that journey of building that capability to experiment?
Great question. So if I take the example of Walmart, I would say, they have been very conscious about the importance of digital and so on, but they're also trying to be very responsive in highly different markets, different from the home base. So China is probably a very good example of a market which is big enough to take seriously, but very different from what they are used to back in the US.
Right.
So to address some of the pain points in the store, they said, well, actually, we should be talking to some startups in China. But the question is, how do you get started? So one of the very simple things they said was, well, we'll take a shortcut. We'll piggyback on the success of some other companies. And of course, and in this case, they went to Microsoft, which is a technology partners of theirs, not at all a competitor. And so the way they started was they spent a weekend with Microsoft, and Microsoft basically curated a set of 8 startups from their alumni who they believed was sort of relevant to retail tech. So a few Walmart executives from the China office spending one weekend doing a hackathon with 8 startups. And in that process, the startup people got to know these Walmart people. The Walmart people got to know the startups, and they shortlisted 3. Now, it cost them nothing other than the time, because Microsoft was happy to do this because they were wanting to put their alumni in front of potential marquee clients. And, if they get some work, Microsoft technologies get consumed. So one of the things to start for a big gorilla is sometimes to piggyback on the activities of existing gorillas. Now, once they identified those 3 startups, one of the things they observed was these Chinese startups were extremely nervous that partnering with a big lumbering giant is going to be a waste of their time. And India, China, emerging markets move very fast. So recognizing this, Walmart said, okay, we are going to now ask you to work on a pilot, and it can take no more than 60 days. And that was such a reassurance to the startups because they wanted to move fast. So they said 3 different, but also in determining what the pilot was, the people who were managing the partnership said, we will first talk to business units, find a sponsor from there, because if this turns out to be good, we don't want to at that point be saying now which business unit within the company wants this. And perhaps the most important detail of all of this is the guy who was driving this was doing this as part of his job as the strategy manager for Walmart China. In other words, it was even a very lean team. And I think he was given 1 assistant. So it was like a 1.5 people team. That's the sort of thing I think that helps to initiate in a way that's more realistic and gets you started and makes you have a meaningful start. And so impressive was the start that when Doug McMillon, the Walmart CEO, was in China for the last time pre-pandemic in 2019. In fact, he came from India. So I think, they had made the big acquisition, Flipkart and so on. So he must have checked that out, come here. And these 3 startups were showcased to him. There was that much pride at Walmart China in what they were doing. That's, of course, the part about initiation. But, they also had the goal was to go way beyond that. So they were starting with the intention to eventually develop the capability. But unless you start, it's very difficult to learn by doing, which is ultimately, I think, how capabilities are built in this space.
That's really interesting because I was kind of trying to correlate this with some of the conversations we have in the ecosystem, and it seems like a slightly different approach might work. So to give an example, very often when global CXOs come down to India, the center ends up having some kind of a showcase or interaction with the ecosystem. And one favorite thing is to sort of bring in the startups, right? Now the question here is that should you bring in a startup to take the permission to need to work with them, or you put in the effort, you run those experiments, and then you show 2 success stories or 3 success stories to be able to say that, hey, look, we went through the journey and these 3 have done some amazing work for us. Suddenly everything shifts. One is like, we could do this, and second is we have done this. One is taking permission, second is maybe taking forgiveness, right? You're still doing the showcases, which is there, right? But I'll maybe from there ask you a different question, right? It's the same point of initiation. So you spoke about, what one could do, and, that tactic could change for company to company.
Yeah.
What should one not do? Right? I think when you're starting out or when you're thinking of working with startups, what should one not do? Because if I had to maybe connect here is because let's say, Microsoft is so big right now, Google is so big right now, SAP, all of them have such, huge programs. It can get confusing or overwhelming in terms of what all is required to work with startups. So if we had to cut through it, what should one not do? Or what's not important maybe?
Excellent question. And by the way, what you said a moment ago, I think it was such a good distinction. Should I bring the startup in to get permission to do this, or should I get the startup in to show what is done? And clearly it's the latter, right? I think that's the mindset that's needed, because I can't imagine any executive saying, oh, I'm going to slap you on the wrist because you did this without asking me, when there is something compelling to see. Now, what should you not do? 2 things come to mind. One is that you should avoid a situation of solutions looking for problems. In other words, partnering with startups is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And so going back to where I started with the why, although I emphasize the how, the why is important. And there has to be a compelling reason to do this. You're building your ecosystem or you're addressing some pain points. That has to be clear. So one of the do nots is do not dive into this and then figure out why you are doing it. I think it's okay to dive into it and figure out how to do it.
Right.
But the why needs to be figured out. The other thing is, do not pretend to be anything other than you actually are. In other words, do not overpromise something to the startup that you cannot deliver. Do not pretend like this is somehow, a cool thing to do when actually what you're dealing with is brass tacks. I think it's much better to give the startup a very realistic picture of what is possible and not possible upfront, rather than try to dazzle and attract and then find that the startup is eventually disappointed. The overall underlying logic, Atit, is this. I think there needs to be a great level of authenticity in terms of what the company is projecting, because even the ones that you say like Microsoft and so on that are big and dandy, I mean, they still struggle a little bit to win the hearts and minds of certain startups. And I think in some cases, it just comes down to this is not a good fit. And one of the things I found Microsoft doing well over time is articulating who they think they can add the most value to.
Right.
That's what I mean by the authenticity.
Got it. And I think this also has a lot to do in terms of the team which is operationalizing this, because odds are when you are experimenting, when you're collaborating, we end up saying no more than yeses, right? And I think it matters a lot in terms of how the no is said. Like I came from the startup ecosystem, if I joined Zinnov, and it's actually a lot of my learnings in the startup ecosystem from other side of the table, which we are trying to bring in here. And one of the things we were talking about was brand, right? Like if a corporate would call, how would a founder respond? We would find typically that companies would end up creating, a reputation for themselves in the ecosystem. Now this does happen in India, but I think one of the things, at least for me, in initiation is that's where authenticity is very important, is because it's okay to be realistic. It's okay to not always have a success story, because people understand it's probabilistic, the outcome. As long as you are with the right intention, there's a follow through in terms of solving for it. I think results, they're not so married to, right? It's the experience which counts. But that being said, like this is still, I think for me, in a way personal, in a way, from the India ecosystem. But how big is the cost of innovation theater? How big is the cost for the individual, not just the company who's trying to collaborate in the ecosystem, in terms of working with startups? As you went about, studying programs globally, what is the cost of not thinking it through when you're starting, if I had to ask that?
That's a very interesting question. I think I have two takes on what you're asking. One is, so the cost of, let's say overpromising and under-delivering and that kind of thing, I think is substantial in terms of reputation, because now big companies that are serious about partnering with startups, in some cases are competing for the hearts and minds of startups. They actually also are trying to establish themselves as a partner of choice, and people see through companies where that don't walk the talk, essentially. But I also want to address the issue of cost to the individual, because I think this is very, very insightful, your question. We talk about companies, big companies and startups partnering, but in the end, it's managers and companies partnering with entrepreneurs in startups. And by the way, I think where there is greater empathy, it is much easier. So many of the companies I've studied have had actually former entrepreneurs like you working for the company and being the bridge. And you also have startup founders who have previously worked in big corporates, and they kind of do a better job, I think, of finding a meeting point. But what I was really getting at is the cost to the individual on the big company side is often one of frustration in terms of building bridges, not with the startup per se, but between the startup and the relevant entities within their big company. Right. In fact, Jeremy Bassett, who set up Unilever Foundry, said to me, it takes a while to get the message through to startups that you're serious about engaging with them. But once they get it, they will beat a path to your door. I mean, if you're in the consumer marketing area, who wouldn't want to have Unilever as a client? He said, what really burnt me out was engaging with the people within the company. And he pointed out to me that a lot of people like him have actually left their employer and now run their own consultancies, giving advice to big companies about engaging with startups. So I think part of what needs to be recognized is this ain't easy. One of the expressions I use in my book is this is effortful, not effortless. But the payoffs can be considerable.
No, that's effortful. It hurts to hear that, but to your point is also important. I think the cost of not doing anything is equally big.
Right.
In that sense. I want to sort of maybe, get a bit more perspective, Dr. Shameen, in terms of this aspect, in terms of working with teams internally. So we have a few questions coming in, and interestingly, they're coming on one-on-one and on the window, but it's all mostly around how do you, collaborate with BU leaders, how do you, get internal buy-in, how do you maintain, the attention of people internally as you're working through. One thing at least which I've seen is this element of trust and respect that, the manager requires in startup ecosystem sort of also goes a long way internally. So it's slightly people driven also, but any perspectives in terms of how these individuals who start the programs went about solving for this whole internal BU collaboration or attention kind of thing?
Okay, so I have a 3-word answer to the question: how do you get more buy-in and support within the company? And that answer is with great difficulty. Okay, so it's not easy. One of the most interesting, most skillful of these people that I found was Shilpa Patel at Infinity, the luxury car brand of Nissan. Mm-hmm. So Infinity is headquartered in Hong Kong, although Nissan is headquartered in Japan. And she was driving this initiative called Infinity Labs. And a bit like the Microsoft Accelerator program that you helped start in Bangalore, they have a co-working space in Hong Kong, and every twice a year they would bring in 8 to 12 startups together and so on. But once that got started, it was very clear to her that without more buy-in inside, they were not going to have more meaningful projects. And so there are 3 categories that, as we were discussing, we identified she was working with. One is internal champions. These are people who are highly ranked in the company, and you just need 1 or 2 of such people to believe in this and to mention this in a town hall meeting or in a newsletter. And in her case, she was lucky that it was the CEO of Infinity. Of course, it helped that she was in headquarters in Hong Kong. But she said after the first couple of times he mentioned this, the program had so much legitimacy when she was speaking to the others. But a second group was sort of more peer-like, other middle managers, people in the business units. And this is referred to as opportunity generators, the ones who actually have the pilot projects or whatever that really meet a pain point. But the third was roving ambassadors, because sometimes it's embarrassing when startups speak to general, like if a startup has heard, oh, such and such a company is doing something for startups, and they happen to know someone within the company and say, oh, have you heard about this? And they say no, which is true in big companies, right? You rarely know what's happening elsewhere, and why would you? But anyway, to kind of get the word out, she had these wider networking kind of events and inviting people. And she said, actually, they became great candidates for mentors, because every startup that joined the program would have an internal mentor. And, it was good to have people like that outside of the partner team who could educate the startups on, the idiosyncrasies of this company, what it takes to succeed. In fact, what some of the subcultures are. With the marketing folks, this is how you behave. With the tech folks, this is what you need to do. But you can also see that was a lot of work. So, again, it's not for the faint-hearted. It's a lot of effort. But I thought this was interesting. As we were discussing, we identified these 3 different levels and layers, and they all have different opportunities.
I completely resonate with that, because I think the legitimacy is very, very important. It sort of conveys, coming from the leadership, conveys that this is an important initiative, it's not a sideshow. I think that's important. The second part is managers, of course, are critical, because, odds are everybody's doing this over and above their day work. So they would want to spend it on something successful, or which could become successful. And then, to your point, these are still minority in the company. There's a larger set of people who are out there for interacting with. So
yes. And just to make sure that it doesn't sound like we are contradicting ourselves, you don't need that legitimacy necessarily to initiate.
Right.
But if you want to go beyond that, then you can't pretend that you can manage without the legitimacy of senior managers. And again, it doesn't have to be everybody.
Got it. So it's almost like this, right? It's like the initial days, what you want to take is forgiveness over permission kind of approach. You build your evidence, show that this really works, get in the legitimacy, scale it, iterate the process importantly, because now you're working at a very, very different scale. And then, maybe think of the interface, right? Or the teams is building this as like a two-sided marketplace. You have to set, it's like, Amazon or Flipkart, that you have the consumers and the sellers. So you have the internal stakeholders and you have the startups, and you're trying to manage both, building both those pieces out, and in terms of building the capability, I guess.
Exactly.
Awesome, perfect. I think we should be on top of the, art. Most of the questions I think we have been able to cover, but, for the audience, if you have any questions, please drop into us. We'll Dr. Shameen maybe bother you with some of those particular answers, which is there. But thank you so much, Dr. Shameen, in terms of, joining us for this session. I'm going through the book. I've been cheating a bit, listening to a couple of the podcasts, but I'm doing both. And I personally love the whole construct in terms of where things started, where things are, and how people have gone about it. So, thank you so much for the book itself and for making time today.
Thank you, Atit. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.